Yeah.
So,
Just one heads up.
yeah.
Hopefully this won't be a problem. I was on a Zoom call earlier, and about like a half hour into it, the audio, like I was still able to speak, but the person on the other end, it got really glitchy.
Huh.
And I don't know if it's because my internet is like a little wonky today, but what we did is like I left the meeting and rejoined, and then everything was okay. But
It's like
just in
technology
case,
where you turn it off for 30 seconds and you turn it back on. You're like,
yeah,
great.
yeah,
Great.
yeah.
All right.
So just in case like you start getting glitchy, I'll be like, hey, yeah, I've gotta like
Yeah, I think you
log
can
off and then log back on. But
chat too. That's fine. If you randomly leave, I'll be like, okay, I'll wait.
yeah.
All right. So if you could just introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, where you're from, and we can get started that way.
Yeah, cool. So my name is Renee Crowley. I am the Deputy Director at the Lower East Side Ecology Center. I'm originally from Minnesota and moved to New York City probably, was it 11 years ago? And moved to New York to go to school for urban planning and landed myself in this beautiful marriage of like urban sustainability. I've always been like a gardener and loved having my hands in the soil and the dirt. And so working in composting in New York City and advancing urban sustainability initiatives has been this like really great opportunity for the last handful of years. I've been working in the compost world, I think the last 6 years, and it's been really, really fun.
If there's any city I feel like that like really could benefit from urban planning in like a green way, it's New York.
Yeah.
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 The concrete jungle can be made green.
Yeah. I thought I was going to move back to Minnesota, and I mean, 11 years later, I'm still here and loving it.
My brother actually went to school in Yukon for urban planning and moved to Manhattan.
Yeah.
And he worked for WeWork actually, which
Mm-hmm.
you know is a funny long story. But he left, and now he lives in Austin, Texas, and he's still trying to do the urban planning. But I always thought that New York would be such a great example, maybe to do like roof gardens or just so much possibility in that city to make it, you know, urban but sustainable at the same sense. So
Yeah.
what do you do for New York City Compost Project, and what is the project all about?
Yeah, so the New York City Compost Project is a program that's funded by Department of Sanitation, and it's basically run in partnership with nonprofits and botanical gardens across the city. So there's, we call them host sites of the New York City Compost Project, of which the Lower East Side Ecology Center is the host site for the borough of Manhattan. In the other boroughs, it's at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Big Reuse is another nonprofit organization involved, Earth Matter, the Queens Botanical Garden, New York Botanical Garden, and Snug Harbor Cultural Center. And so it's really this like community-based, borough-focused initiative that's funded by Department of Sanitation, but the work is actually carried out like in the communities where composting is happening at the community scale.
Does each borough have their own project?
Yeah, yep, each borough has their own project. Earth Matter is out on Governor's Island, so Governor's Island has their kind of own initiative out there. And Big Reuse has been like straddling a few of the boroughs, kind of supporting Queens and Brooklyn for the most part.
What borough are you a part of?
The Lower East Side Ecology Center focuses just on Manhattan.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
So the Department of Sanitation funds that?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And when I first read that, I was like, what is the Department of Sanitation doing funding that? Do you know why? Or
yeah, it's really exciting. And like when you kind of, I've talked to people across the country and they're like, this program is incredible, that like the city government is supporting like community-based composting. It's like such a unique program, but it's been around for 30 years, over 30 years. It launched, if I recall, in 1993, where it was just at the botanical gardens and focused really on like helping people compost in their backyards or like at community gardens. And through the years, the New York City Compost Project expanded, and in like around like 2010-ish, one of the program components was actually to run food scrap drop-off sites, which I'm going to backtrack a little, kind of grew out of this master composter training course, which was one of the
really interesting.
Yeah, it's really an incredible training opportunity, where the master composter course had been happening, and New York kind of started to fill up with these like really expert composters who started to do these like new kind of new programs in their communities that were kind of surpassing the skill set perhaps of the New York City Compost Project staff, and kind of demanding like, we want to run drop-off sites. And eventually the Compost Project expanded its scope of work to actually run food scrap drop-off sites and to manage compost processing sites as well, and to really kind of be this source of providing opportunities for people to actually compost, and to move beyond just like an educational component of teaching folks how to compost in their backyard.
So so you would actually run compost drop off, not you yourself, but perhaps you're a part of it, but the Compost Project would actually have drop off sites for compost.
Yeah.
What would that look like? Did they rent a building? Were they at a certain location through 4 to 6 p.m.? Like, I'm really interested in what that would look like.
Yeah, they're essentially these little like, well, they come in a few different flavors. Some of them are these like commuter compost style drop-off sites, and they just kind of pop up at seemingly random locations, but they're very strategically identified. Sometimes they're in front of libraries or other like community centers. Sometimes they can be set up outside very heavily trafficked subway stations.
Nice.
And then subway on your way to work. And then there are other drop-off sites that are run at farmers markets. And so kind of as you're on your way to a farmer's market, you drop off your crops and then get more materials to cook food, and then compost your scraps, and then kind of be this closed loop cycle.
That's really interesting. So I assume that COVID has had quite an impact on that. Can you speak to how COVID has changed things, or what has changed and what's become more difficult with the coronavirus pandemic, especially in New York, where it was such an issue for most of the year?
So when COVID kind of hit and started to ramp up and things started to shut down, most of the food scrap drop-off sites across the city also shut down. And then simultaneously, the city was experiencing a fiscal crisis, and it still is. And funding for all compost-related programming through the Department of Sanitation was eliminated from the city budget. So what that meant for us is that we lost our funding, and a group of all us community partners kind of came together, and we launched an advocacy campaign to kind of ask the public to save our compost, and sign petitions and write letters to their elected officials. And very surprisingly, but it didn't look very positive, but on June 30th, when the fiscal year 21 budget was passed, there was a partial restoration of our community composting budget, which was really exciting.
Yes.
And we're still kind of like in the process of rebuilding everything that was like shut down. And the other big thing is, besides community composting, New York City was running a curbside composting program where it would pick up food scraps from New Yorkers. It was like a fourth bin where you have your metal, glass, plastic, and trash, and then you had a compost bin. Unfortunately, that program was cut and has not been restored. And so now New York City is just relying on these community partners to run these drop-off sites as kind of the sole option for New Yorkers to compost their food scraps right now.
That's kind of intense. That's
Yeah. So it's been I mean, a wild year for a lot of reasons for everyone. But yeah, the compost world in New York City has seen kind of a shift back to how things were like 5 years ago, when the only option for New Yorkers was to either drop off at a community garden space or at a drop-off site, or kind of compost on their own in their homes. So we're kind of back at that point right now, while the city figures out their budget for composting in the future.
hopefully in 2021 that can get restored. I mean, what a great initiative to have just another bin.
Yeah.
Also, I feel like part of what makes eco and green and sustainable initiatives possible is when they're convenient for people. When people don't have to go out of their way to do something, it makes them being like, oh, of course I'll do that. Of course I'll throw the compost in there, because they don't have to do much. You know, they already have to take out the bins. So hopefully, can you guys talk
it's that convenience, and when the city did launch their curbside program, it kind of converted a sector of the population that wasn't quite ambitious enough to like store their scraps in a bucket and carry it with them like on the subway. Like it opened up composting to a whole new part of the population in New York City.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, how many people live there, right? 14 million people?
Something like that.
Yeah.
A lot.
So like I said, when we first talked, I had a lot of friends that reached out to me because I have a house, I have a backyard, luckily, so I can do composting relatively easy. And I was telling all my friends and my family about how I compost because I was really excited about it. I don't like throwing out food scraps. And they would kind of have the same rhetoric if they lived in the city, that they couldn't compost because they lived in like a studio or a one-bedroom apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So just from your knowledge, and I guess taking COVID into account, how can people compost in their apartments? Can they compost? What would you suggest in terms of kind of some tips and tricks about composting in a small city apartment?
Yeah. So what I usually ask people when they're like, I want to compost, I want to, keep my food scraps out of landfill, I kind of ask people like where their motivation is coming from. Like, what is their goal? Are they someone who wants finished compost, that like nutrient rich material that you can like put on plants? So if someone's a gardener or has house plants that they want compost for, I would suggest that they get an indoor worm bin. It's this really great and fun way. If you have kids or you're an adult who likes worms, that's okay too. But it's basically like a large Tupperware container that you get these special worms. They're called red wigglers, Icena fetida. And there are these worms that are great for composting. And you add these worms to this bin, you create a bedding of newspaper, and then you just add your food scraps to that. And the worms and the kind of bacteria and other microorganisms that are kind of present in this little system break down your food scraps and create vermicompost, which is like a very nutrient-rich form of compost that you can then harvest and put on your plants, give away to friends, go scatter on whatever sort of green space that you have access to. But that's if you're feeling like a little motivated, you want to be involved in the composting process, you want to see things break down. I've also seen people who have maybe like a patio create like a little, not a worm bin, but like a enclosed compost bin on their patio. So a great style of composting that's good for your patio could be like a tumbler model. It's like fully enclosed, so you don't have to worry about like rats or raccoons necessarily getting into it and or creating like a mess like that your landlord is going to be mad at you for creating afterwards. Tumblers are a great option too if you have a small space and you want to like make compost and use the finished compost on your own
Like
too.
a dryer? I'm envisioning like a dryer where it's like tumbling.
Yeah, it like I've actually seen people convert like pickle barrels into like a compost bin, and you like can add a rod through it, and so it spins, and it's yeah, you just kind of put your food scraps in there. The one thing I will say for anyone who does want to compost on their own, there are some great guides across the internet, but the quick rule of thumb that I just share with folks is make sure you also have a source of browns, which are like a carbon-rich material such as leaves or wood chips, that you add that into your tumbler bin as well. If you just add your food scraps, you're going to create like a nasty, horrible smelling mess. But what makes composting magic happen is by creating this like compost recipe of a balance of wood chips and leaves with the food scraps that you're trying to compost too.
So
I like to say you're creating this like habitat or an ecosystem for all the microscopic decomposers and bacteria to do like the work of decomposition.
it really is an ecosystem, you know, especially with like the worms, and
Yeah.
cool to watch, you know, it really is cool to see it happen. But so for people that don't know about the browns, which I think is really important, you brought that up. In terms of like the mix of compost, what would you suggest for people that are just starting off? Like, what is that right mix that would really get things flowing, you know, in that ecosystem?
Yeah. I usually say like a 50-50 mix is a good place to start. If things are getting like a little messy or you got some odors that are coming up, don't be afraid to add more browns. Really, like the only drawback to adding more brown material is it'll just break down much slower, which is fine. We should all be patient and embrace a slow lifestyle, I think. But if you don't add enough browns, there are a lot more problems that can come into play with like odors and messes and like.
What are browns? Like what browns do you compost at home?
I used to. I used to have a backyard, and I don't anymore.
Yeah,
but I now just bring my food scraps to work with me.
I love it. So you know you work at a great place. But for browns, like what do you mean by browns, for example?
Yeah. I mean, browns are carbon-rich materials such as leaves, or wood chips, or wood shavings. So if you happen to have a friend who's a woodworker, which everyone does, no, just kidding. But like you can find a wood shop that has wood shavings left over to add to your bin as well.
What about things like egg cartons and cardboard? Would that suffice?
It would suffice. I usually recommend anything that can be recycled in your curbside recycling, just go to a curbside recycling. If you're going to rely solely on cardboard or newspaper or egg cartons, your pile's going to get kind of messy. Like it doesn't quite have the same capabilities of absorbing excess moisture as like the power of wood chips or leaves.
That's interesting. I didn't know that actually.
Yeah.
That's a
I
fun
think if like you could mix like paper products in with your leaves, but I wouldn't solely have a compost pile that was relying on paper products as your carbon material.
So fall's a really great time to start a compost if anybody's listening and wants to start a compost.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
have no shortage.
I tell all the exactly. I tell all the people at community gardens, like, rake up those leaves and put them in a bin, because by the time you hit August and you're out of leaves, like, it's gonna be a smelly compost pile.
That's a brilliant idea, actually. Maybe you could brand
Yeah.
that like compost leaves, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, I mean, I think I know why composting is important, excuse
Yeah.
me, but what are your thoughts on it? Like what do you teach with the New York City Compost Project to your students essentially about why are we doing this? Why is this important?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, again, when I talk to people, I try and figure out like where they're coming from and what their experiences are to talk about the importance of composting, because there's like tons of reasons why I think it's really important. One of the reasons that I've been talking to folks a lot more lately about kind of ties into climate change, and I think this is really compelling too when you talk about like food, like growing food and like food security and food justice, where when food scraps end up in a landfill, they generate methane, which is a really super potent greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. But when food scraps end up in a compost pile, you can create finished compost, which is a super excellent soil amendment and can build healthy soil. And when you have healthy soils with healthy plants growing, you can actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere and have it be stored into the soil. And so thinking of it as this like cycle of either you can put food scraps in a landfill and it contributes to climate change, or you could put your food scraps in a compost pile to actually reverse the impacts of climate change. The answer feels like it's like very clear. Um, Another big reason that I think composting is important is just like land use and environmental justice issues, where a lot of landfills and waste transfer stations and like truck routes to get this trash to landfills go right through environmental justice communities, which are low income and communities of color. And I think if there are ways to reduce the amount of truck traffic and activities at these landfill locations impacting these communities, and look for better alternatives such as composting in neighborhoods directly in your community, so you're not having to burden those communities with your waste. Um, in New York City, at these community compost sites, we try and keep food scraps as local as possible so that they aren't like trucked to far away processing sites. And so it's kind of a way to think about communities managing their waste locally instead of having to burden other communities with these waste management practices.
Also, when you were talking about that, I just had the visual of like trucks, these big trucks that are using this either diesel or gasoline that are taking the food scraps like wherever, how far, to a different location to dump them in a landfill. It just feels so wasteful at so many levels of that.
Yeah, yeah,
So if
yeah.
you
And
go ahead.
all right, yeah, and I was going to say another interesting thing is that actually compost facilities employ more people than landfill facilities. So when you think about creating green jobs, if we have more compost facilities, there can be more opportunities for employment and usually safer working environments too.
Has there been any initiatives in I tried to do this actually where I'm from in Saratoga, but I actually tried to do it with single-use plastic, where I would go and try and recycle the restaurants' plastic sustainably, or try and get them to not use plastic as a whole. And I just thinking about New York City, about how many restaurants there are and possibly food waste in the restaurant industry is
Yeah.
mind-blowing and a little disheartening, to be honest. Do you know any initiative?
Yeah.
Let's talk about, I guess, pre-COVID, where organizations, maybe it was the Compost Project, would partner with restaurants to do what you're talking about?
So the New York City Compost Project just focuses on the residential waste stream. And what makes New York kind of a challenge, but it's also just unique, is that all the commercial waste is managed by private waste haulers, and all of the residential waste in New York City is managed by the city and like taxpayer money. Since the compost project is funded by taxpayers, we just focus on the residential waste stream of food scraps. But on the commercial side of things, there have been some new laws that have been passed requiring restaurants of different sizes to compost their materials. And there's policy in place to like keep increasing that to a point where all restaurants should be composting their food scraps. That's sometime in the near future.
Yeah, hopefully sooner rather than
later. And
later.
there's like waste hauling services. Yeah, I don't remember the timeline of this, but I know like they started with all the big restaurants, and like stadiums have requirements to compost. And then they're working their way down to requiring smaller businesses.
That's great. So you said earlier that you only got a partial amount back from the city government for the budget that you guys usually work with. I assume you're taking donations.
Yes, we are. Yeah, you can donate to the Ecology Center.
I was going to say, where, if people that are listening to the podcast, if they want to donate to the New York City Compost Project or to the Ecology Center to help kind of make up the difference that was cut in the budget, where can people go to do that?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, each compost project host site is a separate entity. So it's the botanical gardens across the city, and then it's these 3 nonprofit organizations: the Lower East Side Ecology Center, Big Reuse, and Earth Matter. And so you can make a donation to those organizations separately to make some contributions to continuing community composting. And you can also write to your elected officials and let them know that composting matters to you. It's not too early to start planning for the next fiscal year. Next year's budget is probably already being discussed in City Hall. And we're afraid that compost is going to be back on the chopping block and getting ready to launch probably another advocacy campaign in the next year, just to let our elected officials know that New Yorkers care about composting. So I would encourage folks to get their advocacy hats on and practice their letter writing campaigns to their elected officials to let them know that composting matters to them.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anything wrong with writing a letter telling them how you feel, especially when something as important as a city as big as New York.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. You are an abundance of knowledge.
Yeah. And if anyone has questions, you can reach out and shoot us an email at the Ecology Center.
What is that email?
So our website is just www.lesecologycenter.org. We're on Instagram and like share a lot of stories and facts about composting on there too, at LES Ecology CTR. And then if you want to just shoot us an email, it's info@lesecologycenter.org.
LES, yeah? Ecology?
Yeah.
Awesome. Renee, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I'll include all of this information in our show notes so that people have easy access to it if they, want to donate. I really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to.
Thank you. It was good talking to you. Take care.
Talk to you too. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.